What if the very person meant to protect your newborn baby was the reason they never came home? What if the hands meant to heal were quietly delivering death? Genene Jones was trusted. She wore the uniform, spoke the language of compassion, and walked the sterile halls of hospitals as a nurse for children. Parents thanked her. Doctors praised her. But in her wake infants were dying. One child, then another, and another. Always under her watch. Always after an unexplained emergency. And no one wanted to believe what was really happening. But the pattern couldn't stay hidden forever. Bodies were piling up. Reports didn't add up. Autopsies raised more questions than answers. A baby would crash suddenly, be pulled back from the brink, and then crash again. 60 babies all gone. Dozens of tiny graves. So many names erased before they could even speak. Was she seeking attention? Feeding on chaos? Or was it something darker, something methodical, cold, and calculated? The truth behind Genene Jones is not just disturbing. It's buried beneath years of silence, medical cover-ups, and shattered families still searching for answers. And the terrifying part? She almost got away with all of it. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell icon. Because this is the story of the nurse who became a nightmare, and the children who never had a chance. She was the nurse every parent wanted by their baby's side. Attentive, calm, always the first to respond when a child's heart stopped. But behind the soft voice and the blue scrubs was something unimaginable. Genene Jones didn't just witness medical emergencies, she created them. Hospitals trusted her. Mothers thanked her. But tiny lives kept slipping away one after the other, while she stood by with a syringe in hand. From the crowded pediatric units of San Antonio to the quiet clinic in Kerrville, the pattern was always the same. Healthy babies crashing without cause, and one nurse always there when it happened. What no one knew was that the greatest threat to those children wasn't disease. It was the woman hired to save them. Genene Jones entered the world on July 13, 1950, in Texas, not into chaos or poverty, but into the arms of an adoptive family that gave her every opportunity to feel safe, wanted, even special. But from the very beginning, those closest to her sensed that something inside her didn't quite fit the mold of a typical child. As she grew, so too did a strange hunger for attention, an obsessive need to be seen, heard, validated, not in the innocent way that most children crave affection, but in a way that felt forced, calculated, a performance laced with desperation. Teachers remembered her as disruptive, classmates kept their distance, and while her home life offered stability, it never seemed to quiet the chaos behind her eyes, chaos that would one day manifest in ways no one could have imagined. By the time she reached adulthood, Genene's craving to be at the center of every storm had evolved into something much more dangerous. She didn't have the grades to become a doctor, her academic record made that dream impossible, but instead of walking away from the world of medicine, she simply found a side door. In the mid-1970s, she earned a license as a vocational nurse, an LVN, a role that allowed her into the most vulnerable places in society: hospitals, clinics, pediatric wings, places where life and death often sit on the same pillow. It wasn't long before her co-workers began to notice her unusual behavior, her tendency to volunteer for the most high-risk patients, the critical newborns, the babies no one was sure would make it through the night. While most nurses hesitated to work such emotionally taxing cases, Genene practically ran toward them. She was described by some as overly confident, by others as aggressive, and by many as someone who always had to be the hero of the story, even if that meant creating the crisis she could later resolve. Time after time, she found herself at the bedside of a child in distress. Sometimes she was already performing CPR before help was even called. Other times, she stood eerily calm while alarms blared. And always she was the first on the scene, acting as though she alone could bring a baby back from the brink. But something wasn't right. The codes, those terrifying moments when infants stopped breathing, turned blue, or suffered cardiac arrest, began to cluster around her shifts. Babies who had been stable just hours before suddenly deteriorated when she was assigned to them. And somehow, no matter how many emergencies occurred, no one seemed to put the pieces together. Her actions were brushed aside. Her questions to doctors were seen as ambition. Her proximity to tragedy was called a coincidence. But how many babies have to die before a coincidence becomes a pattern? And in those early years, while the hospital hallways stayed quiet and the records remained buried, that pattern was already taking shape, right in front of everyone. Let me ask you this: have you ever had a gut feeling about someone that you couldn't quite explain? A vibe, a chill, something in your bones that said, this person is dangerous, even when they wore a smile. Because someone did. And soon, they'd wish they'd listened to that feeling much sooner. At San Antonio's Bexar County Hospital in the early 1980s, there was no outward sign of the horror unfolding behind its white-bricked facade, no alarm loud enough to drown out the chilling pattern that began emerging inside the pediatric intensive care unit. Parents came here with fragile hope, entrusting their newborns, some only days old, to machines, doctors, and nurses trained to preserve the thinnest threads of life. But hope began to crack when, without warning, infants who had been stable hours earlier began slipping into unexplained cardiac arrest. Alarms would blare in the dead of night, staff would rush in, tiny bodies would tremble or go still, and sometimes, if luck was on their side, those lives would be pulled back from the brink. But other times the monitors would flatline and families would be left shattered, staring at the impossible. A healthy baby gone in seconds and no one able to explain why. What made it more disturbing was that there was no disease outbreak, no malfunctioning equipment, no hospital-wide issue. Just a slow, mounting trail of critical emergencies clustered under the same roof, within the same walls, and all happening on the same nurse's shift. Her name? Genene Jones. With her short stature, brisk demeanor, and tightly clipped voice, she moved through the unit with a kind of intense focus that some described as devotion, others as obsession. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind to doctors, often injected herself, literally and figuratively, into the most serious cases, and had a reputation for being hands-on. In fact, she insisted on it. While some nurses avoided the stress of trauma and resuscitation, Genene seemed to welcome it. She would always be the first to respond when a baby began to code, and strangely enough, those codes happened almost exclusively on her watch. The other nurses noticed. At first, it was a gut feeling, one of those quiet instincts no one wanted to voice aloud. But the unease grew. They saw how Genene would hover too close to medication carts, how she would insist on being the one to administer drugs during emergencies, how she always seemed one step ahead of a crisis, as if she knew what was coming before it began. When babies began suffering sudden seizures, unexplained drops in oxygen, and mysterious bleeding episodes, people began keeping count. More and more often, the babies who crashed weren't even the sickest on the floor. Some were recovering, scheduled to go home, even smiling and feeding just hours earlier. And yet, one by one, their fragile bodies failed, often just long enough for Genene to be the one to swoop in as the hero, performing CPR, calling code blue, fighting to save a life she may have just taken to the edge. Eventually, the whispers among the staff turned into hushed warnings. A nurse finally voiced the unthinkable to a supervisor. It's like she's playing God, choosing who lives and who doesn't. By now, hospital administrators had also taken notice. The records didn't lie. There were far too many incidents clustered in too small a window of time. The odds didn't add up. But rather than confront what was becoming increasingly obvious, they stalled. They feared the fallout, the lawsuits, the media frenzy, the damage to the hospital's reputation. So instead of launching an investigation, they chose silence. They let her go, quietly, discreetly. No criminal referral. No red flag to the next employer. The only record of their suspicions sat buried in internal memos and confidential conversations. Documents that wouldn't see the light of day until it was far too late. And just like that, Genene Jones walked away, her license intact, her secrets protected. And the children she had already taken, left behind with nothing but grief and questions no one wanted to answer. When Genene Jones arrived in Kerrville in early 1982, the town welcomed her without question. Tucked into the Texas Hill Country, this was a place where doors were rarely locked and neighbors still waved from their porches. The pediatric clinic, run by Dr. Kathleen Holland, was a cornerstone of the community, an unassuming building where parents brought their children for checkups, vaccines, and reassurance. And when Jones, a nurse with critical care experience, joined the team, no one could have guessed what they were truly inviting in. To the untrained eye, Genene was everything a nurse should be: alert, assertive, fiercely confident. She moved through the clinic like someone on a mission, often volunteering for the most urgent cases, inserting herself into procedures with a kind of urgency that others read as passion. But behind the scenes, her presence became a pattern, a red flag slowly being hoisted inch by inch. At first, the changes were subtle. Babies began having unexpected reactions to treatments. Infants who'd come in with nothing more than ear infections or low-grade fevers would, within minutes, slip into seizures or sudden respiratory distress. Bleeding episodes with no clear cause, sudden drops in blood pressure, unexplained paralysis. These emergencies didn't add up. Parents were left speechless, their lives shattered in real time. And as grief settled over the clinic like a fog, Genene was always there. First to sound the alarm, first to rescue the child, and sometimes, the last to see them alive. Dr. Kathleen Holland, a respected pediatrician with years of experience, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Initially, she wanted to believe the best. After all, emergencies happen. But the numbers were off. The timeline was off. The deaths were accelerating. In one particularly disturbing case, a healthy infant who had been recovering well suddenly coded after receiving an injection Jones insisted was routine. Within minutes, the baby was dead. And there it was again, Genene in the room alone with the syringe. Holland began keeping her own secret records, jotting down incidents, noting who was on shift, comparing symptoms. It was a private investigation born of desperation, conducted in the shadows of a clinic that still bore the outward appearance of normalcy. But the deeper she looked, the more chilling the truth became. Genene wasn't saving lives, she was engineering crises and choosing when they would end. Nearly every child who suffered a medical emergency shared one chilling detail. Genene Jones had been there. As suspicions mounted, Dr. Holland was left with a terrible question. How could she prove the unthinkable without concrete evidence? And even if she did, who would listen? The idea that a nurse, especially one who had already worked in a major hospital, could be deliberately harming babies seemed too grotesque to accept. But what if the pattern wasn't just coincidence? What if this wasn't about one or two incidents, but a system that had allowed a predator to move from hospital to clinic, undetected and unrestricted? Ask yourself, if your colleague, your trusted right hand, was at the center of a rising death toll, how would you confront it? Would you speak up, knowing the fallout could destroy your clinic, your career, and your peace of mind? How do you look a grieving parent in the eye, knowing you let the danger in? And worse, how many babies had already died before someone was finally willing to say the word out loud? Chelsea McClellan was only 15 months old when she was fatally injected with succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant that caused her to suffocate. The small, innocent girl was left gasping for air as her life slowly slipped away, while Genene Jones, the nurse tasked with her care, stood close by. Imagine the horror. Chelsea's parents, trusting their child to the hands of a nurse, never could have imagined that the woman in scrubs was the one who would ultimately snuff out their daughter's life. How could a person trusted with the most vulnerable of lives make a decision so final, so cold? And yet, Chelsea's tragic death wasn't an isolated case. Rolando Santos, a young child, suddenly suffered a collapse while under Genene's watch. The cause? Unknown. No warning signs. No previous health issues. And yet, in the blink of an eye, Rolando was gone. The hospital staff, like many others, could only guess. Was it negligence or something far more terrifying? How many children had to die before the truth came to light? Then there was Joshua Sawyer, another baby whose life was abruptly stolen. He was just a little boy, a child who should have had years ahead of him, yet he ended up another victim of a nurse who wielded power over life and death with a syringe in hand. Joshua's death, like so many others, was sudden and without clear explanation, causing his family unimaginable pain and confusion. What happened to him? What could have been done differently to save him? And Richard Nelson, an infant in critical care, was rushed into a medical emergency, but it was already too late. The young boy's body went limp as the nurse at his side did nothing but watch. Was it a medical complication, or had Genene's touch once again caused another fatal collapse? Theories and suspicions ran wild, but no answers came. This was not just a random occurrence. This was a pattern, one that would soon claim more lives. Rosemary Vega, Michael Martinez, Lupe Gonzalez, Jennifer Hall, Patrick Zavala, and Johnny Lopez, each of them taken in similar, mysterious circumstances. Babies whose lives were extinguished far too soon, families torn apart by the unknown. Were these innocent children simply victims of a cruel twist of fate, or was there something darker at play? Could someone have stopped this madness before it spiraled further? As you hear these names, ask yourself, how could an entire system, hospital administrators, doctors, and nurses, have overlooked the mounting body count? What would you do if you were a parent, suspecting the unthinkable, yet finding no one who would believe you? Could you live with that fear, knowing that the person you trusted to care for your child might be the one responsible for taking them from you? The questions linger, unanswered, just like the families left behind to grieve. How many more lives could have been saved if someone had connected the dots sooner? How many had to die before someone finally spoke up? These were not just names, they were babies, children, families shattered by the dark secret of Genene Jones. And the true number of victims might never be known. It was Dr. Kathleen Holland who first put her career on the line to confront what others had been too afraid, or too complicit, to speak out about. The deaths didn't add up. The children who collapsed in her care weren't terminally ill, they weren't expected to die. But over and over again, healthy infants began coding without warning, turning blue, gasping for air, and then slipping away as the monitors flatlined. And standing nearby time after time was Genene Jones. And yet Dr. Holland couldn't ignore it anymore. She began documenting each incident, each mysterious reaction, and when Chelsea McClellan, a bright, bubbly 15-month-old girl, arrived for a routine vaccination and ended up dead shortly after Genene's injection, Holland made the decision to act. She ordered an autopsy. She pushed for toxicology. And what they found would become the linchpin in one of the most disturbing medical cases in U.S. history. Inside Chelsea's body was succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic agent used to temporarily stop a patient's muscles during surgery. In controlled settings, it can be life-saving. In the hands of someone like Genene, it became a silent killer. Sux, as it's called in emergency medicine, leaves no trace once it metabolizes, unless the body is preserved quickly and tested early. Chelsea's body had been, just in time. It was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. With toxicology evidence in hand, Genene Jones was arrested in 1983 and charged with Chelsea's murder. The courtroom, packed with parents and press, heard horrifying testimony, infants screaming before suddenly going limp, nurses recalling how Genene seemed almost thrilled during resuscitation efforts, doctors replaying the mounting confusion as more and more children failed to survive routine treatments. In 1984, she was convicted of murder and of causing injury to 6 other infants. Her sentence, 99 years in prison. It felt like justice for a moment. But then, in a twist that stunned the nation, the Texas mandatory release law came into play. Enacted to reduce prison overcrowding, the law granted inmates early release credit for good behavior, regardless of the severity of their crimes. Under this loophole, Genene Jones, a convicted baby killer, suspected in dozens of other deaths, became eligible for release after serving only a portion of her sentence. Families were devastated. Prosecutors were livid. And the public demanded answers. Was this justice? But the story didn't end there. Determined to keep her behind bars, investigators reopened cold cases. In 2017, a new grand jury indicted Genene on 5 more counts of murder involving children who died under her care at the Bexar County Hospital in the early 1980s. With overwhelming public outcry and new evidence connecting her to additional victims, prosecutors moved forward. In 2020, facing a mountain of damning testimony and no path to freedom, Genene finally pled guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer, one of her infant victims. In doing so, she avoided trial but not punishment. The court handed her an additional 60-year sentence, guaranteeing that she would never walk free. No more loopholes. No more early release. She will die behind bars. But the question still haunts so many. How many more children did she harm? How many families were never told the full truth? And how many people in power allowed it all to happen because they were too afraid to act? Can one sentence ever match the scale of such horror? Do we call it justice now, or is it simply too late? In the aftermath of Genene Jones's conviction, the medical community in Texas, and across the nation, was forced to confront a chilling reality. The very systems designed to heal and protect had failed to stop a predator working in plain sight. Her case exposed fatal cracks in the structure of hospital oversight, nurse supervision, and institutional accountability. In response, Texas lawmakers passed legislation requiring hospitals to report suspicious deaths, unusual medical emergencies, and staff behavior that could endanger patients. Medical records, once easily buried or shredded, were now subject to stricter preservation laws. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. The hope was clear: never again. But even now, decades later, the shadows of her crimes still stretch across time. Genene Jones was convicted of a handful of murders, but investigators, doctors, and even prosecutors have estimated that the true number of her victims could be far higher. Some say 40. Others say 60 or more. And the horrifying truth is that we may never know. Countless hospital files were destroyed, suspicious deaths were misclassified, and many grieving families were never told their child's death was even in question. For every confirmed victim, there are others who simply slipped into silence, their final moments undocumented, their stories unfinished. And that leaves us asking, how does a crime this massive go unanswered for so long? How many children have no gravestone, no justice, no acknowledgement at all? Was Genene Jones the lone monster? Or was she a product of a medical culture too focused on protecting reputations to protect patients? Who else looked the other way and why? If this story disturbed you, haunted you, or simply made you question who we trust with our lives, then take a moment to like this video, share it, and subscribe. Because evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a stethoscope and a smile. And sometimes, the people who should stop it, don't. Next week, we delve into the shocking case of a gifted surgeon who wasn't satisfied with saving lives. So he began removing organs, not for science, not to help others, but because he could. Make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. What if the very person meant to protect your newborn baby was the reason they never came home? What if the hands meant to heal were quietly delivering death? Genene Jones was trusted. She wore the uniform, spoke the language of compassion, and walked the sterile halls of hospitals as a nurse for children. Parents thanked her. Doctors praised her. But in her wake infants were dying. One child, then another, and another. Always under her watch. Always after an unexplained emergency. And no one wanted to believe what was really happening. But the pattern couldn't stay hidden forever. Bodies were piling up. Reports didn't add up. Autopsies raised more questions than answers. A baby would crash suddenly, be pulled back from the brink, and then crash again. 60 babies all gone. Dozens of tiny graves. So many names erased before they could even speak. Was she seeking attention? Feeding on chaos? Or was it something darker, something methodical, cold, and calculated? The truth behind Genene Jones is not just disturbing. It's buried beneath years of silence, medical cover-ups, and shattered families still searching for answers. And the terrifying part? She almost got away with all of it. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell icon. Because this is the story of the nurse who became a nightmare, and the children who never had a chance.